The quiet observer Sarah Taylor stood in the corner of the office lobby, her mop sweeping across the floor with practice ease. The monotonous squeak of her cleaning supplies echoed in the otherwise silent hallway, broken only by the hurried footsteps of employees who rarely spared her a second glance. She was 45 years old, with deep brown skin that spoke of strength and resilience from generations before her. Her solid no-nonsense build made her appear unremarkable to most, and that was just the way Sarah liked it. People underestimated her, and that gave her an edge. Her brown eyes, sharp and observant, never missed a detail. From the corner of her eye she noticed the way David Hanson, the smug white manager, strutted past her every morning, his tailored suits looking too expensive for the building they worked in. He never acknowledged her presence, never looked down from his self-important posture. To him Sarah was just another cog in the machinery, a janitor who existed to serve to clean up after people like him. But Sarah wasn't just a janitor, she was an undercover inspector sent to investigate the department's discriminatory practices. She had been working here for merely 6 months now, quietly observing the internal workings of the company, learning the ins and outs of its corrupt system. Her mission was clear: expose the biased and unethical behavior of people like David Hanson, whose smug confidence masked the deep racism and systemic corruption running through the company's ranks. Today, as she wiped down the elevator buttons, Sarah's thoughts wandered. She had seen enough to know that something wasn't right in this department. She had witnessed the preferential treatment given to certain employees, the way promotions seemed to always go to the same few people, and the discriminatory comments that were made behind closed doors. But what had stood out the most was David Hanson, his arrogant nature, his dismissive attitude toward everyone around him, especially the Black and Latino employees, had caught her attention immediately. One day as she was cleaning the break room, she overheard him making a comment about one of the company's top clients. He had said, "We don't need these people coming in here taking up space. They'll never understand how business really works." He hadn't even bothered to lower his voice. To him, no one was worth noticing unless they had the same privilege and status he did, and the janitor in the corner wiping down the counters, well, she didn't even deserve his acknowledgement. But Sarah had learned long ago how to remain invisible, how to navigate the world without causing waves, without drawing attention to herself. She had been underestimated her entire life, and she had come to embrace that fact. It was a strength, not a weakness. No one saw her coming. Today was like any other. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and Sarah moved from floor to floor, quietly going about her duties. As she made her way to the break room to clean up the table, she noticed David and a few of his colleagues gathered around the coffee machine laughing loudly. Sarah was used to this. It wasn't unusual for employees to use their breaks to gossip and joke at her expense. She'd heard the comments, the occasional snare about her work, the rude remarks about her appearance, but today something felt different. David leaned back against the counter holding a styrofoam cup of coffee. He had a smirk on his face, the same arrogant expression that had always bothered Sarah. "So have you seen that janitor around here?" he asked one of his colleagues, a man named Greg, who was always eager to join in on any conversation that could make him feel important. "She's been cleaning up here for weeks and still hasn't learned to stay out of the way. I swear these people have no respect for boundaries." The comment stung, but Sarah didn't flinch. She kept her eyes on the floor, pretending to focus on her cleaning as the conversation continued. "I know, right?" Greg chimed in, looking Sarah up and down like she wasn't even a person. "It's like she thinks she's invisible or something. If she was half as good at her job as she is at blending in, maybe she'd actually get something useful done." David chuckled, his voice dripping with condescension. "Well, I suppose we can't expect too much from someone in her position, can we? It's a shame, really. If she worked anywhere else, maybe she'd actually have a shot at something more than a broom and mop." The laughter that followed was light-hearted, almost as if they were discussing a minor inconvenience. Sarah's heart didn't race. She had heard worse before. The familiar sting of their words faded as quickly as it had come. What mattered now is that she wasn't there to play their game. As Sarah finished cleaning, she moved toward the trash can to dispose of the contents of her cleaning supplies, but before she could reach it, she saw something that made her stop in her tracks. David had finished his coffee and without a second thought tossed his empty cup into the trash. But it wasn't just his coffee cup, it was the lunch Sarah had brought with her that day, which she had placed on the counter. It wasn't much, just a simple sandwich and an apple, but it was hers. She had packed it with care that morning, as she did every day, and now it was crumpled at the bottom of the trash, mingled with used paper towels and food wrappers. David's face registered nothing as he turned to leave, his back still still turned to her. It was clear he hadn't even realized the mistake he had just made. For a moment Sarah stood still, her mind bracing. This wasn't just another careless mistake, it was a deliberate act of disrespect, a gesture that in its own way summed up everything that was wrong with this place. It wasn't just the trashing of her lunch that upset her, it was the complete disregard for her humanity, her worth to David Hansen. She was nothing more than someone to be dismissed, someone who didn't matter. But Sarah wasn't just a janitor, she wasn't just someone to be dismissed or forgotten. Today she would show him just how wrong he was. The unseen hand. Sarah Taylor sat in her small one-bedroom apartment that evening, staring out the window at the setting sun. The soft orange glow cast long shadows across the room, illuminating the small details of her life. The modest furnishings, a well-worn sofa, a coffee table stacked with books and magazines, told the story of a woman who valued practicality and simplicity over anything else. Her eyes, sharp and perceptive, had seen much over the years, but tonight her thoughts were consumed with the events of the day. David Hansen's careless action had triggered something deep inside her, a feeling that she had buried for years. She had dealt with indignities all her life, small moments of disrespect, the kind that accumulate over time until they define how you see the world. She had always let it go, knowing that one misstep could cost her everything. But today was different. Today something inside her had snapped. The lunch in the trash wasn't just a personal insult, it was a reflection of the larger system that Sarah had spent years quietly observing. The prejudice that ran through the veins of this company wasn't just casual, it was systemic. From the top executives to the managers who walked the halls like kings, they all believed that their entitlement made them better than others. They believed that their privilege gave them the right to dismiss people like Sarah without consequence. But what David Hansen hadn't realized was that Sarah wasn't just a janitor. She had spent years climbing through the ranks in different departments, working her way into roles that allowed her to learn the ins and outs of corporate corruption. She knew how to stay out of sight and how to blend in when necessary. She knew how to observe the small details that others overlooked, and now she had been assigned to expose the very system that Hansen represented. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, breaking her thoughts. It was a text message from her contact at the Department of Labor. "We're ready, report in tomorrow morning at 9:00. Oh, and Sarah stared at the message for a moment, her fingers resting on the phone screen. This was the moment. The investigation had been building for months, and now it was time to take action. David Hansen's department had been flagged for multiple violations of workplace discrimination laws, but Sarah's investigation was about to dig deeper than anyone realized. It wasn't just about uncovering what was visible on the surface, it was about exposing the culture of entitlement, the insidious ways racism and favoritism permeated every decision, every policy. She had been a part of this department for long enough to understand the rhythms of power. The managers like David Hansen who didn't care for the janitors, the HR department that turned a blind eye to complaints from minority employees, the way promotions were always given to the same few individuals regardless of merit. Sarah had seen it all, but what people like Hansen didn't know was that she had quietly gathered evidence. She had documented every discriminatory comment, every time an employee of color had been passed over for a promotion, every instance where their hard work had been ignored in favor of someone with more favorable connections. Sarah's job was to remain invisible, to be the quiet observer who collected the evidence without ever being noticed. That evening she sat down at her small kitchen table and began reviewing her notes. She had learned to organize the information in a way that would make it irrefutable. Discrimination wasn't just about the overt acts of racism, it was about the ways people were made to feel invisible, unworthy and unheard. It was in the way they were spoken to, the way they were excluded from important meetings, the way they were treated as if their contributions didn't matter. Sarah had already identified several key players who would be vital in her investigation, but it was David Hansen who was at the heart of it all. He was the one who made the calls, the one who controlled the promotions, the one who reinforced the culture of bias in the department. His behavior towards Sarah was just a microcosm of the larger issues at play. The way he belittled her, missed her and treated her like she was nothing more than an invisible servant. That was the way he treated everyone beneath him. He didn't think twice about tossing her lunch into the trash, but he was about to learn a very painful lesson. Sarah was not invisible. The next morning Sarah woke early as she always did and Dressed in the same blue jumpsuit and scuffed sneakers she had worn for months to the untrained eye, she was just another janitor, just another face in the crowd. But today she would be more than that. Today she would be the one to bring David Hansen down. As she entered the building, she took a deep breath, steadying herself. The halls were still quiet, the early shift workers rushing to their desks, their heads down, eyes fixed on the screens in front of them. Sarah moved through the building like a shadow, unnoticed, blending into the background. She stopped briefly at the break room to checked the layout of the area. It was the perfect place to observe without being seen. There Sarah would wait for her chance to confront Hansen. Around mid-morning, the moment she had been anticipating arrived. David Hansen strode into the break room, his suit sharp and his demeanor even sharper. He grabbed a coffee, barely glancing around as if the room was there for his convenience. Sarah watched him closely from her corner. The time was now. She waited until the moment was just right, when the room was quiet and Hansen was alone, engrossed in his phone. Then she took action. She moved toward the table where her lunch had been tossed the day before. She'd replaced it with a fresh sandwich wrapped neatly in paper and a crisp apple resting beside it. As she carefully set it down in front of him, she spoke. "Mr. Hansen," she said, her voice calm but firm. He looked up, startled for a moment. His eyes scanned her, momentarily registering surprise, then his gaze narrowed, his lips curling into a dismissive smile. "Back again, are we?" he said, as though it was beneath him to speak to someone like her. "What's this? You want something else to throw in the trash?" Sarah didn't flinch. She stood her ground. "No, Mr. Hansen," she replied, "I'm just here to make sure you're not throwing anything else away." She let the words linger in the air for a moment. Hansen stared at her, confusion flickering across his face. "I don't know what you mean," he said, his voice suddenly colder. "Oh, I think you do," Sarah said quietly. "You see, I'm not just the janitor around here. I'm the one who's been watching. I'm the one who knows exactly what's been going on in this department. The promotions you've been handing out, the way you've been treating people like me like we don't matter." The realization hit him hard like a slap to the face. His smug confidence began to slip, replaced by a growing sense of unease. "You think I'm invisible, Mr. Hansen," Sarah continued. "Well, I've been watching you too, and I think it's time the truth came out." The words hung in the air, and in that moment David Hansen knew he had made a grave mistake. The unraveling, the tension in the break room was palpable as words hung in the air. David Hansen, the arrogant manager who had once dismissed her as nothing more than a background fixture, stood frozen in place. The confident smirk that usually graced his lips had evaporated, replaced by an expression of uncertainty that didn't suit him. His eyes narrowed as he processed the situation, clearly trying to assess how he could regain control. "You're threatening me?" His voice was sharp, defensive, as if the idea that someone like Sarah Taylor could challenge him was incomprehensible. His gaze flickered from her to the lunch she had placed in front of him, a symbolic gesture he couldn't quite understand. "No, Mr. Hansen," Sarah said evenly, her calm demeanor belling the intensity of the moment. "I'm just making sure you understand the consequences of underestimating people you don't even care to know." She paused, letting her words sink in. "You've been treating everyone here like they don't matter, but I matter, and what you've done isn't just wrong, it's illegal." David's eyes flashed with irritation, but there was something else in his expression now, fear. It was a small shift, but it was there. For the first time in years he wasn't in control of the situation, and the realization that someone had seen through his carefully constructed facade shook him. His eyes darted around the room looking for an exit, but there was none. "Not anymore. Look, I don't know what you think is going on here," David began, his voice now strained, trying to regain his usual authoritative tone, "but you're way out of line. I don't have time for this. If you think this is some kind of I'm not here to argue with you," Sarah interrupted, her voice unwavering. "I'm here because I have the evidence to shut you down." David took a half step back, his mind racing. What evidence? Who would believe her? She was just the janitor, the invisible worker who barely registered on the radar. Who could possibly care what she had to say? But the words that Sarah spoke next made him stop in his tracks. "I've been documenting everything," she said calmly, pulling out a small nondescript notebook from her pocket and flipping it open. She didn't show him the contents, but the quiet assurance in her movements was enough to make David's stomach tighten. Every discriminatory comment, every biased decision, every promotion that went to someone who didn't deserve it. "I've got it all." The weight of her words was like a punch to the gut. David's mind raced as he tried to process the information. How could she have known? How long had she been watching? "You can't do this," David said, his voice low and trembling. "Now you don't have the authority. I'm the manager here. You're just a janitor." Sarah's lips curled into a faint smile, but there was no humor in it. "And that's where you're wrong," she said. "I'm not just a janitor. I'm an undercover inspector Inspector, I've been here for months gathering evidence on the corruption that you've been running. Your department's practices have violated multiple labor laws, and it's only a matter of time before everything comes crashing down. David felt his knees weaken, a wave of panic rising in his chest. He had always been so careful, so calculated in how he maintained his position of power. He had silenced whispers of discontent with threats and manipulation, but now for the first time someone was in a position to take him down. He couldn't afford to let this happen. He wouldn't listen, David said, trying to regain some semblance of composure. You're making the huge mistake. If you think you can take me down with some notebook of yours, you're wrong. No one will believe you. No one will care about a janitor making accusations. You're just some nobody. Sarah's eyes flickered with a cold intensity and her voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. You're wrong again. I've already reported this department. I've already collected enough to bring down your entire operation. I've got colleagues waiting for me to hand over the evidence. You'll be done, Hansen. This is over for you. The words hit him like a sledgehammer. David's arrogance faltered completely. He had been so sure of his position, so confident in his ability to bully and manipulate those beneath him, that he had never considered that someone like Sarah could be his undoing. Now his mind was reeling with the weight of the situation. No one is going to care about a few complaints, Sarah, he sneered, trying to project his old confidence. The people in charge, they don't care about your little crusade. You're not nothing to them. Sarah stood tall, her posture unwavering, her eyes locked on him with unblinking determination. You're wrong, she repeated, her voice firm. They'll care when they see the evidence, and when they do they'll shut you down. You'll lose everything, your job, your reputation, your position of power, everything. David opened his mouth as if to protest, but nothing came out. The certainty in Sarah's voice, the calmness with which she spoke of his downfall, unsettled him. He was no longer the one in control. It was as if the ground had shifted beneath him, and now he was standing on unstable ground. You're going to regret this, he spat, though his words lacked conviction. His anger was now tinged with fear. Maybe, Sarah replied coolly, her eyes narrowing slightly, but at least I'll know I did the right thing. You should have never underestimated me, Mr. Hansen. With that, Sarah turned on her heel and walked out of the break room. She could feel David's eyes boring into her back, but she didn't care. Her heart was steady, her mind focused. She had done what she needed to do. Now the wheels were in motion, and David Hansen's reign of arrogance was coming to an end. As Sarah made her way down the hallway, she felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. She had been underestimated for so long. No one had ever expected her to stand up, to take action, but now she had done more than stand up. She had exposed a truth that no one had been willing to see, and that truth would be the key to taking down the system of corruption that had been thriving unchecked for far too long. The reckoning, the days following her confrontation with David Hansen, felt like a slow unraveling, a quiet storm brewing just beneath the surface. Sarah Taylor had always known that exposing corruption wasn't an overnight process. It wasn't about making grand gestures or drawing attention to oneself. It was about building momentum, collecting the pieces of a larger puzzle, and then watching as the truth slowly but inevitably came to light. Now, as she sat in her modest apartment staring at the files in front of her, she knew that this was just the beginning. The evidence she had gathered wasn't just damning, it was explosive, a systematic pattern of discrimination, biased hiring practices, unfair treatment of employees, and most critically, an institutionalized culture of corruption that had been ignored for far too long. Sarah had been patient, careful. She had anticipated the pushback, the resistance. What she hadn't expected, however, was the level of desperation David Hansen would resort to in order to protect his empire. As Sarah skimmed through the paperwork, she couldn't help but think back to the moment in the break room. The look on Hansen's face had been a mixture of confusion, of disbelief, and the first real hint of fear she had seen in him. Up until that point he had been confident in his power, his entitlement, but Sarah had shattered that illusion in a single moment, and now she was watching the fallout unfold. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a message from her contact at the Department of Labor. "We've got your back. We'll initiate the investigation tomorrow. You did great. Get ready." A surge of adrenaline coursed through Sarah's veins. The wheels were turning now. There was no turning back. The decision had been made, and the investigation would go public in a matter of hours. But even as she prepared to submit her evidence, Sarah knew that there would be consequences. David Hansen wasn't going to let this go quietly. He would fight, he would manipulate, and he would do everything in his power to salvage his career. The next few days would be crucial. The next morning Sarah arrived at work as usual. She donned her worn blue jumpsuit, tying the laces of her sneakers with the same deliberate care she always did. To the outside world nothing had changed. She was still the janitor, the invisible woman who moved silently through the halls unnoticed by the high-powered executives who passed her by each day. But inside Sarah was different. Her resolve was unshakable. She had always known the importance of remaining unseen. She had perfected the art of blending into the background, of observing without drawing attention, and now that skill would be her greatest weapon. As Sarah made her way through the sterile hallways of the building, she noticed the tension in the air. There was a palpable unease among the employees. Whispers circulated and heads turned in her direction more frequently than usual. It wasn't just the typical office gossip. There was a sense of anticipation, as if everyone knew something was about to happen but didn't quite know what. When she reached the break room, she spotted David Hansen standing near the coffee machine, his back straight, his jaw clenched. He was talking to a few of the senior managers, his voice rising in frustration. He had clearly been told by someone that Sarah was the one behind the investigation, and now he was scrambling to cover his tracks. Sarah stood in the doorway for a moment watching him. He hadn't seen her yet, and she wasn't ready to reveal herself. The last few days had been a game of cat and mouse, and the final move was coming. David's voice cut through the air, sharp and demanding. "Who is it who's been feeding information to the Department of Labor?" he hissed. "I'm not going down for this. I don't care who's behind it. I'll destroy them." Sarah's lips tightened, but she didn't react. She knew what was happening. Hansen had already begun to lay the groundwork for his defense, casting blame on anyone and everyone except himself. He was playing the victim now, trying to spin the narrative in his favor. It was a classic move: deflect, deny and attack. But Sarah knew the truth that would eventually make all his lies irrelevant, and with the evidence she had, Hansen would have no choice but to face the consequences of his actions. A few minutes later Sarah heard a voice behind her. "Sarah, can I talk to you for a second?" She turned slowly. It was one of the senior supervisors, Claire, who had been with the company for years. She was a quiet, methodical woman, someone who rarely drew attention to herself. Sarah had always respected her work ethic, even though they had never been close, but today there was something different in her eyes, something that suggested Claire knew more than she was letting on. "Of course," Sarah replied evenly, stepping away from the break room door. She had no idea what Claire was about to say, but she could feel the weight of the conversation in the air. Claire glanced around the hallway, making sure no one was within earshot. Then she leaned in, her voice low. "I don't know what's going on, but I know David's been hiding something. I heard him talking to HR yesterday about how he's going to deal with you. He's been telling people you're the one who's been stirring up trouble." She paused, her eyes filled with concern. "You need to be careful. He's dangerous." When he's backed into a corner, Sarah nodded, her face impassive. "I know, but I'm not backing down. It's time for the truth to come out." CLA hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "I believe you, but if you're really going to bring this all down, you're going to need more than just your evidence. Hansen will do everything he can to make it look like you're the problem. He's already spinning the story in his favor." Sarah's gaze hardened. "Let him spin. The truth is stronger than any lie he can tell." Claire nodded, but her expression was still one of concern. "Just be careful. If he figures out that you're the one behind all of this, he'll stop at nothing to make you appear." Sarah didn't say anything more. She didn't need to. She knew the stakes and she knew the risks, but she also knew that she had already come too far to turn back. The reckoning was coming, and no matter what Hansen did to try to stop it, the truth would always find a way to surface. By noon, Sarah was no longer just the janitor. She had become the focal point of a much larger storm, one that was about to break wide open. Hansen's attempts to discredit her had already begun, but he had no idea just how outmatched he was. The evidence was too strong, too undeniable. The truth was inescapable. As Sarah prepared to submit the final report to the Department of Labor, she felt a surge of determination. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for everyone who had been mistreated, ignored and belittled. She was fighting for every person who had been silenced by the system. This was bigger than her. It was about justice, and justice was coming. The storm unleashed the day after her confrontation with David Hansen. Sarah Taylor was both resolute and reflective. The meeting with her Department of Labor contact had gone exactly as planned. The evidence she had carefully gathered, months of documentation, screenshots, internal emails, witness statements, was more than enough to warrant a full investigation. Hansen into Hansen's department. As Sarah sat at her kitchen table flipping through her notes, she couldn't help but feel the weight of what was about to unfold. It wasn't just David Hansen that she was bringing down, it was a culture, a deeply ingrained system of inequality that had been allowed to fester unchecked for far too long. But for the first time Sarah felt empowered, as though the decades of quiet resistance had finally led to something concrete. She wasn't just a nameless figure on the periphery anymore. She was at the center of a storm, and soon the people responsible for the toxic environment at the company would have to face the consequences of their actions. The day ahead would be a pivotal one. With her evidence now in the hands of the Department of Labor, the wheels of accountability had begun to turn. But Sarah wasn't going to sit back and wait for the inevitable. She had seen firsthand how these systems of power worked, how they could smother the truth if left unchecked. So she had a plan, a final piece in her strategy to ensure the truth came to light and that Hansen's empire of privilege would come crashing down. That afternoon Sarah walked into the office as usual, her posture unbothered and her presence as unobtrusive as ever. To the unknowing eye, she was just another part of the corporate machinery, another janitor who blended into the background. But she wasn't. Not today. She would be the catalyst for change, and everything was about to shift. David Hansen was at his desk when she passed by, his face flushed with the remnant of their earlier encounter. He looked up at her as she moved past, his gaze sharp with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "You think you've won?" he spat, his voice low, the venom barely contained. "You have no idea who you're messing with." Sarah didn't break her stride. She didn't even look back, but she couldn't stop the slight curve of her lips as she whispered under her breath, "You'll see soon enough." The elevator door slid open and Sarah entered without hesitation. She had learned long ago that those who thrived on power were often the most fragile when it came to their own downfall. David Hansen had built his position on the backs of others, on people he thought were too invisible, too meek to fight back. What he hadn't realized was that his arrogance had blinded him to the truth. The most dangerous people aren't always the loudest. Sometimes it's the quiet ones who can bring everything crashing down. Sarah's first stop was the HR department. She had made sure that several of her colleagues, employees who had witnessed the everyday injustices but felt too powerless to speak up, had been contacted and prepared. Their testimonies would be key in the investigation. She knew Hansen had manipulated his way to the top, and it wasn't just him. There were others too, people who played along with the system because it benefited them. But the truth would be laid bare. All of them would be exposed. As Sarah stepped out of the elevator, she passed the glass offices where the high-level executives sat, their backs to the world. They were protected by layers of bureaucracy and privilege, but that was about to change. Sarah was about to show them that no one was truly untouchable, not anymore. Inside HR, she found her contact Carl sitting at his desk, his face grim. He had been a part of the investigation from the start, feeding Sarah the information she needed to fill in the gaps. Carl's quiet, unassuming nature had allowed him to gather crucial evidence without raising suspicion. "I've got everything," Sarah said, sitting down across from him. She placed a thick manila envelope on the table. "It's all here." Carl nodded, glancing around to ensure they were alone. He quickly opened the envelope and began flipping through the documents. As he read, his expression darkened. He had seen the evidence before, but there was something different about this moment. The magnitude of it, the inevitability of the storm that was about to hit, seemed to weigh on him more than ever. "This is it," Carl said quietly, tapping a stack of papers. "This smoking gun, this is the evidence we needed." "I know," Sarah replied, "but we need to do more than just hand this over. We need to make sure they can't bury it. We need to make sure the public knows what's been going on behind closed doors." Carl looked at her, concern flickering in his eyes. "Are you sure? Once this goes public, there's no going back." "Unsure," Sarah said with determination. "I've been invisible for too long. I've watched this company make a mockery of fairness, make a mockery of people who work hard every day just to be treated with dignity. It's time for them to face the consequences." As Sarah spoke, her phone buzzed on the table. It was a message from the Department of Labor. "The investigation begins tomorrow. Prepare for a full audit of Hansen's department. We'll need your full cooperation. This is bigger than we thought." Sarah felt a surge of satisfaction. The wheels were turning and there was no stopping them now. But there was still one last thing to do, making sure Hansen understood just how much trouble he was in. She excused herself from HR and walked back toward the break room where she knew David would be. He was never far from his territory, a little area where he could rule with unchecked power. But today he wouldn't have the control he was used to. Today he would learn what happens when you underestimate someone who's been quietly Watching from the shadows, David was sitting at the table when Sarah entered. His eyes flickered up, but he didn't say anything at first. He was still smarting from the earlier confrontation, but he wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of acknowledging it. "I know you think you've got this all figured out," Sarah said, breaking the silence, "but trust me, you don't. You've crossed a line, Mr. Hansen, and now you're going to pay for it." David's lips twisted into a sneer. "You think you can bring me down? You're nothing but a janitor. You don't know what you're up against." Sarah's smile was cold, unwavering. "You're about to find out, David. You've hurt too many people for too long, and now it's time for you to face the music. You're not the one in control anymore. I am." David's expression faltered, his confidence evaporating in the face of her certainty. He stood up abruptly, knocking his chair back. "This isn't over," he spat, his voice thick with venom. "You'll regret this." But Sarah didn't flinch. She had come too far to be intimidated by him now. "I don't think I will," she said unobtrusively. "You will." With her last conflict with David Hansen, Sarah had laid the preparation for the retribution that was going to unfurl as the examination started. The pieces started to get sorted out. Would Hansen's self-importance and propensity for narcissism be his demise, or would the framework he addressed have the option to safeguard him? Sarah was going to figure out the retribution. The days that followed Sarah's conclusive conflict with David Hansen felt like a close-to-home hurricane. As the examination unfurled, the tension started to mount. The division of work had started a full-scale review of the office, and as the proof Sarah had assembled begun to flow, the walls around Anand started to disintegrate. His pomposity, once a safeguard, presently turned into his greatest risk. When Sarah strolled into the workplace on the morning of the consultation, obviously things were at absolutely no point ever going to be similar in the future. Her stomach stirred somewhat, however. It wasn't dread that made her uncomfortable, it was the heaviness of realizing that today was the climax of all that she had worked for. The calm strength, the flexibility, the long periods of persevering abuse, every last bit of it had prompted this second. David Hansen was mysteriously gone when she showed up, and briefly it seemed like the workplace was pausing its breathing, trusting that the tempest will raise a ruckus around town. Air was thick with expectation. Sarah took a full breath as she strolled past the front counter, her developments consistent. Furthermore, purposeful inclination, the eyes of the workers upon her. They all realized something was going to happen, something huge, and Sarah as consistently resisted the urge to panic. Centered, her telephone hummed and she checked the message rapidly. "The conference starts quickly, be prepared." The words brought a feeling of resoluteness. It was time. As Sarah entered the lunchroom, she saw a couple recognizable appearances, associates she had quietly upheld during that time, individuals who had seen the treachery in any case, felt too frail to even consider standing up. They generally checked out at her with a combination of wonder, furthermore, appreciation. They understood what she had done, and they realized what was in question. David Hansen's area of expertise had been based on abuse, honor, and foundational segregation, yet presently, interestingly, the individuals who had been mistreated were as of now not imperceptible. The reality of the situation was being uncovered, and Sarah was driving the charge. She wasn't simply a janitor any longer. She was the voice of the quieted, the person who dared to face the poisonous culture that had contaminated the office for a really long time. As the consultation initiated, Sarah sat unobtrusively at the rear of the room, her heart consistent, however her brain hustling. Before her a gathering of high-level chiefs sat, including the very individuals who had chosen not to see the division's wrongdoing. Among them were the very individuals who had empowered Hansen's way of behaving. The people who had murmured in corners and looked the alternate way when representatives were tormented, bothered, and abused. Sarah realized she had needed to stay created. This wasn't about feeling any longer, it was tied in with uncovering reality. The consultation started with an initial assertion from one of the branch of work agents who framed the discoveries from the review. The room developed peaceful as the agent itemized the various occasions of separation, provocation, and unlawful rehearsals that had been accounted for by workers. As the rundown developed longer, Sarah felt a tranquil fulfillment in her chest. This was all there was to it, the evident evidence that Hansen's domain of honor had been based on an underpinning of falsehoods and double-dealing. Yet it was only after Sarah's name was called that the genuine effect of her work started to soak in. Miss Sarah Taylor, the examiner reported, kindly approached the room, moved as Sarah stood up, her shoes tapping delicately on the floor. Each eye in the room was on her. As she strolled toward the front of the consultation space, briefly she felt the heaviness of their looks. Some were thoughtful, a few uncertain, and some tremendously unfriendly, yet it didn't make any difference. She had acquired this second. As she sat down, Sarah looked over at Hansen, who was perched on the contrary side of the room. His face was flushed with outrage, his eyes dashing apprehensively between the procedures and the developing heap of proof. Briefly he made eye contact with her, and Sarah recognized the concise gleam of acknowledgement, easily the acknowledgement that he had underrated her in the absolute worst manner. However, it was past the point of no return, for that now he had lost Miss Taylor. The examiner started. You've given us basic proof in regards to the practices in Mr. Hansen's division. Might you at any point kindly clarify for the board how you came to accumulate this data? Sarah gestured, her voice quiet and estimated. I've worked in this division for north of 2 years, she started. Furthermore, during that time I saw firsthand the fundamental issues that were tormenting the working environment. Separation was uncontrolled. Advancements went to some unacceptable individuals in view of individual predispositions rather than legitimacy. Workers were bugged and deprecated for their race, their orientation, and their financial status, and when the people who attempted to stand up were met with reprisal, they were quieted. However, I didn't allow that to happen to me. She stopped, letting the heaviness of her words settle. It wasn't simply the realities she was sharing, it was her reality, and it was unquestionable. I was allotted to this division as a covert reviewer. Sarah went on with the undertaking of exploring the poisonous culture that had created under Mr. Hansen's administration. I recorded everything: the obnoxious attack, the civil yet unavoidable racial inclination, the cover-ups, the reprisal against those who attempted to defend what was correct. I tracked gatherings, updates, and grievances. I even recorded direct discussions that demonstrated how Mr. Hansen and others in the office had manhandled their important, influential places. Sarah's voice never faltered as she talked, and the room held tight every word. She wasn't simply an observer now, she was the linchpin of the examination, and as she proceeded with the truth of the defilement that had flourished in the division became more clear. Mr. Hansen's activities weren't detached. Sarah said he was permitted to pull off these things since people with significant influence either chose to disregard or now and again effectively upheld his way of behaving. Individuals who should consider him responsible decided to disregard the proof since safeguarding him was simpler than to rock the boat. Yet I was unable to hold on and allow that to happen. Sarah turned her look toward Hansen, who was currently apparently perspiring, his hands grasping the edge of the table. This happens when individuals as are you permitted to work without oversight, without responsibility, she said discreetly. This happens when individuals figure they can pull off abusing others since they think nobody is observing. However, I was watching, and presently every other person is too. The quietness in the room was thick with strain as Sarah wrapped up speaking. Hansen's face was pale, his pomposity presently totally supplanted by dread. He had no responses, no safeguard. The weight of his activities had come crashing down, and nothing remained for him to do except for, aside from the unavoidable. The examiner went to the board, his demeanor serious in light of the proof introduced today. Plainly, Mr. Hansen's direct abused organization strategy as well as a few work regulations. His activities have hurt various representatives and made a threatening, oppressive workplace. We suggest quick activity, including the end of Mr. Hansen's position and a full survey of the division's practices. The room ejected in mumbles, yet Sarah stayed formed. This was the second she had worked for, and it was unfurling precisely as she had trusted. The arrangement of force that had safeguarded Hansen for such a long time was at last being destroyed piece by piece. After a tense interruption, the seat of the board spoke. Mr. Hansen, you are thusly feeling better of your obligations. You will be accompanied out of the structure quickly. A full examination will be directed into the division's tasks and suitable lawful activity will be taken. Hansen's face wound in dismay. You can't do this, he yelled, standing up unexpectedly. You have no thought what you're doing. I'll sue every one of you. However, Sarah just watched, her articulation faithful. It wasn't her fight to battle any longer. Reality had previously won. Hansen's tongue was a frantic last-line exertion. However, it was useless despite what had previously been gotten rolling. As the security group accompanied Hansen out of the room, Sarah stood feeling a feeling of absolution wash over her. The tempest had passed and equity was at last being served. Individuals who had been violated, the ones whose voices had been hushed for such a long time, were presently being heard. And concerning Sarah, she realized that her work was far from over. However, today she had stood firm, and for that she could be glad. As she left the building, Sarah felt a feeling of harmony settle inside her. She had done what she had decided to do. She had uncovered the defilement, and she had cut down a framework that had permitted it to flourish. The tranquil strength that that had conveyed her through such a long time had at last prompted a snapshot of when, and as Sarah left the place of business, the weight of the past at long last lifted. She knew that her story and the tales of those she had battled for would be told for quite a long time into the future.